All right, guys, welcome to another session of answering your questions. The first question I have is, why does God in the Old Testament, for example, swallowing up Korah and his children, seem to be more merciful than God in the New Testament? For example, Jesus. So, first of all, every person since Adam and Eve deserved death. When they chose to sin, they chose to exist in a realm outside of God because sin cannot exist with God. And outside of the Creator can only be a realm of decreation or destruction. And that's why the wages of sin is death. So, because of sin, our new normal becomes deserving of death. But God, He would show grace, and showing grace is to give what's undeserved to those who were still sinners but showed faith in God. These heroes of faith would be temporary mediators between God and His people. Um, those that didn't stand behind those God chosen mediators would be subject to what they deserved, which was death. So it was only by standing behind these mediators that they were able to get in on the grace, the favor, the mercy of God, and again, which was not deserved. The only thing that was deserved was death. And the tribe of Korah had the highest rights of the three Levite tribes that were in charge of maintaining the tabernacle. Okay, so that in and of itself is a great privilege, a very high privilege for the people of God to be able to go near the tabernacle, and not just go near, but touch it, to be those to maintain it. But they weren't satisfied with that. The tribe of Korah, even though they were the highest of the three tribes, they were not satisfied with that. They wanted the roles of Moses and Aaron. They wanted to be the high priests, the mediators that would go in and communicate with God. And so they tried to overthrow the leadership and forge their own, but they weren't chosen by God and were expected to stand behind Moses and Aaron, the mediators. So they decided to have a showdown to see whose side God was on, instead of starting a civil war of some sorts. They wanted to let God settle the matter. So they would bring all their sacrifices before God, and whoever the earth would open up and devour would prove God's wrath towards them. But what did Moses do before the showdown? In his true mediator fashion, showing just why God chose him in the first place, he again and again, and even now, senses God's anger with his people, just with their disobedience, right? Just complaining all the time about being in the wilderness, not being in the promised land yet. He could sense God's anger, and even in this moment where there's such strong opposition, just a threat of violence, he falls face down to cry out to God. He asks God to have mercy on all the other members of the community, and so God grants this to the mediator in Moses, and warns everyone to stay away from the insurrectionists during this showdown, because eventually they would be swallowed up. And they didn't have the faith to realize that this would actually happen, that this would really happen, that God's wrath would truly devour them. And they lacked the fear of God to realize that their actions would even cause their own children to suffer as well. And so, why doesn't stuff like this still happen? Jesus, God's one and only begotten Son, laid down his life and paid the price to defeat the wages of sin. Right? He satisfied his Father's wrath on the cross. He was the ultimate sacrifice where blood would no longer have to be shed to pay for sin. God, he was always merciful, but a life had to be a substitutionary sacrifice for someone to be in good standing with God again, because God, again, is a perfect, sinless God, and sin cannot exist in his realm. And so his perfect, sinless Son became that perfect substitutionary sacrifice for all to be righteous before God again. And so God's mercy was always there, and his patience with Israel proved it over and over again. But we all now have access to it because of Jesus. And before I move on to the next question, I just want to challenge you guys to actually go and read the Psalms that were written by the sons of Korah. I can't remember exactly how many of them are. I think it's 8 or 11. But not all the Psalms are written by King David, and some of the most beautifully written, just the greatest Psalms were actually written by the sons of Korah. And there are Psalms where they're talking about better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. Right? There's nowhere else that they would rather be in the entire world, that they would rather be in the courts of God forever, right? And I think that Psalms like that, writing like that, it's really a reflection of the sins of their ancestors, right? The people that were, because of their lack of faith, right, that were devoured in the wrath of God, right, who had the highest places, right? They had the highest places in the court, at the temple, in terms of the tabernacle, and they took that for granted, right? They took that for granted, and in reflection of that, the sons of Korah that survived, generations on down, they make these beautiful confessions of how they would rather be in the courts of God. And at that point, they were now at the lowest position, right? They were kind of like the janitors of the temple, right? They had kind of the lowest positions in the temple, but they preferred that over anything else, because they just wanted to be in the temple of God. And so I think those Psalms really beautifully reflect just their reflections on the history of their ancestors, and it just kind of shows like the beauty of God's redemptive work, how God can make beautiful things from dust. And so I want to challenge you guys to do that. Second question is, what does God think of rioting? Is it a sin to use violence? And so we've heard this saying many times, but justice is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's just what justice is. And this principle has to be maintained by a court of law in society in order to maintain order. And I say a court of law because if everyone had the right to enact justice according to their subjective point of view, right? If everybody was their own judge, then there'd just be absolute chaos, right? Because not everyone's view of justice, right? Their view of who's right, who's wrong. It's not all the same, right? And so there would just be so much crisscrossing and just so much chaos, and ultimately our society would be destroyed, right? Society would crumble. But there has to be due process under a trusted judge and a jury that will objectively administer justice. Okay, this is the best version of society that we can possibly have. But if that system is corrupt and biased, or in this case racist, right, then it's understandable why people would seek to create their own justice, because they're just not going to get it if they're by sitting around, right? Because no one's going to go out and get it for them if they're not going to do it for themselves. And so it's understandable, right? It's understandable why these things are happening, why there is so much anger, so much rage. However, I do not believe that we have the biblical right to tear down governmental systems. Even Jesus did not come to physically tear down Rome, but he let Rome tear him down so that he would show people a better way. Right, when Jesus was being arrested and Peter drew his sword, Jesus said, "You live by the sword, you die by the sword. Violence will only lead to more violence." And Jesus taught us to love our enemies and pray for them. That if someone, it's not just if someone slaps you on the cheek, but it was actually a backhand, right? And that's like the most disrespectful way of being hit, right? If someone disrespects you by backhanding you in the face, he said, turn the other cheek, right? Give them the other cheek. And that if a Roman soldier, which they did in these times, there was laws that required the Jews to do this. But if a Roman soldier came and ordered you to carry his 66-pound bag for a mile, instead of complaining and then getting beaten up by those soldiers, Jesus taught to carry it an extra mile, go the extra mile, right? Carry it for 2 miles. And this is why we call Jesus the suffering servant, right? This is not just stuff that he told us to do, but he lived it out himself. We are called to carry the same cross to defeat injustice with the love of God. We could do far more good by being martyred as a loving Christian than to fight fire with fire. And I believe that Martin Luther King Jr., who we celebrate every February, I believe that he held the same beliefs as a pastor, as an activist, and that he followed this model of Christ. And so rioting or the use of violence for any injustice, I believe, would not be considered godly by any biblical standards. And number 3, I'm actually going to combine this with the 4th question because they're very related actually. But number 3, can other religions like Catholic people or people who are Jewish make it to heaven? What does the Bible say about this? Number 4, do Catholics go to heaven? Are their beliefs valid or wrong? Okay, so speaking of MLK, right, Martin Luther King Jr., the original Martin Luther was a very important figure for Christianity, and I would suggest that you look into him, especially if you think that he is a black person that looks like the MLK that we are mostly aware of. I do challenge you to go ahead and do some research on Martin Luther. Okay, so not Martin Luther King Jr., but Martin Luther. But to keep this response short, the Catholics did what the religious leaders did in Israel with Judaism. The reason why Jesus was so against the Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, those religious leaders of those times, the reason why that Jesus was so against them was because they corrupted their religion for their own gain. Okay, so they really changed what the purpose of the religion was for their own benefit. And even with the Jewish religion, it was always about faith. When you go to the hall of faith in the book of Hebrews, right, you see that even in the Old Testament, right, even before Jesus, that our faith in God was always about exactly that, faith. Right? There was nothing that people could do to earn salvation because of sin nature. This was something that needed to be understood from the very beginning, that we are sinners and that there was nothing that we could do to earn our salvation. It was only through faith that people could be in God's grace and mercy. Right? It was only through faith that we could come into that place where God would give us what we didn't deserve, which was his grace and mercy. God wanted an intimate love relationship with creation so that we could enter that space through only through faith and a mediator, right? Works righteousness, which is doing things to earn salvation, this leads to pride and arrogance and causes us to actually depend on ourselves rather than God, right? And so when it becomes about works righteousness, when it becomes about doing our own sort of pious deeds to earn salvation, that expands the space, the room for us to become puffed up and to become arrogant and prideful, and to start thinking, you know what, like I could do this on my own. I can do this without God, and so we could build for ourselves our own babbles, just as an illustration, but. It leads to pride and arrogance. It leads to a self-dependence. It leads to just a lack of trust and what connects us to God. But the Jewish leaders, they made it about works. Okay? They placed themselves between the people and God. Right? It's supposed to be, just this direct relationship, faith-based relationship with God, but they placed themselves between God, and they made people feel like they needed to earn salvation, right? They added a bunch of stuff to the Mosaic laws, and they came up with all these oral traditions, and they added in all these little minute details that people had to follow to a T. And instead of being a religion, a faith that is based on and purposed on love and intimacy with God, it became all about works righteousness and deeds, right, and doing things to earn salvation. And what they're ultimately doing by doing that is this gives them the power and the authority to exploit people and to benefit off of them, right? It causes people to become dependent on them. And so when Jesus came to this earth, the religious leaders, they were working with the Roman government to get rich off of the people and to leave them with little to nothing. For those of you that have been joining us for our Bible studies recently, we've been talking about this, right? About how most of the Jewish people, they were just stuck in poverty because of all the temple taxes, right? The religious leaders in the temples, collecting certain amounts from the people, right? There was also the taxes that they had to pay to the Roman government, but then there were the Jewish tax collectors that were working for the government, and they were lying about how much the people owed to the government so that they could pocket some of that money for themselves, right? And so here are all these people, just exploiting them and benefiting and getting rich off of them. And this is the stuff that was happening that Jesus really spoke out against so many times in the gospel. And it's not so much just greed that Jesus was so opposed to, but it was the greed masked in religion, right? So it was the greed masked in faith, right? And so these religious leaders that were benefiting off of people, but under the guise of it being religious, of it being pleasing to God. And so the early church was eventually able to break off from this, through Jesus and what he accomplished on the cross. And the church it was founded on faith. The early church was founded on faith. And the Apostle Paul, he talks about, when you study his letters, he talks about being justified by faith and not by works, right? That we are made right before God. We're righteous before God by our faith in Jesus and not by our deeds, our works, that we somehow could earn our salvation. But a few hundred years later, the Roman government, they got their hands on the religion again, right? The people of God again, and they started working with the priests to gain control over the people. Right? They took the word out of people's hands and they made the people as Bible illiterate as possible, right? So that you had to depend on the Catholic priests to know the word. Right? It wasn't like now where we all have our own Bibles, we have multiple copies, and we could just do our own quiet times, our own devotions, and study the Bible on our own. But you had to go to church, you had to go and listen to the Catholic priests, and you had to receive the word in that way. And so this essentially put all the power back into their hands again, and this enabled them to tweak things and base Christianity off of faith and works. Okay, so not just faith, but now works. And they reintroduced this wicked idea of earning salvation to the people of God once again. And the people were under their control so much that it even got to the point where people had to pay money for forgiveness. Okay, so for a lot of us now, that seems like a wild idea that people would even buy the fact that you had to pay money to receive forgiveness, right? If any of our pastors said that now today, we would be like, this guy is crazy. I'm leaving. I'm going to a different church, right? But the people were under such control and such influence that it reached that point where this was a common practice, and it was called indulgences. So Martin Luther, who did not see, all this stuff aligning with the actual Bible, right, the actual Word of God, he came up with 95 reasons why the Catholic Church was corrupt, and he started what we call the Protestant Reformation, and that's why we consider ourselves the Protestant Church, right? We consider ourselves, right? We kind of separate Catholics, Protestants, but he started the Protestant Reformation, where we would protest. That's coming from Protestant, right? Protest against the Catholic Church, and we would reshape Christianity based on faith alone. But since Catholicism is still based on faith plus works, a knowing Catholic, someone who realizes this and knows this, would need to repent from it in order to be saved. And if you don't understand that you are a sinner, okay, that you are depraved and there's nothing that you can do to earn salvation, and so because of that you're completely dependent on Jesus as the one and only high priest. There's no other priest or pastor that needs to come in between, right? It is strictly business between you and Jesus, right? You are completely dependent on him to restore you to God, to be the base of your salvation, and that you don't base your salvation off of any other things, right? Then if this is not your foundation, then you cannot be saved. Okay? This has to be your foundation. And there's passages about how Jesus is the chief cornerstone, right? He is the foundation that we need to base our entire faith and our lives off of. Because Jesus said himself that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one can get to the Father except through him. And so it is our faith in Jesus that saves us. It's only through Jesus. And so for that reason, Jews also cannot go to heaven if they don't believe in Jesus as the Messiah. And so, and so goes the same for all the other religions. It is only through Jesus. There is only one road that leads to heaven. And as Jesus said, right, there are many wide roads that lead to hell. Okay, there are many paths that we can take in this world that are very easy to take, and those paths lead to hell. But the path to heaven is straight and narrow, and that way is Jesus. He is the one and only perfect and the holy nexus to God, the very thing that connects us to God, the very person that connects us to God. Number 5 is, what can I do to ensure I go to heaven? I have actually already answered this question. So if you go back to my answering the questions session that I did on May 7th of this year, you can find the answer to that question. And so I'm not going to answer this one again, and I'll skip over to our last one, number 6, which is, sometimes I find it unfair that a person could go to heaven despite having a good, easy life on earth. Is that possible? I feel like there's at least one person who got lucky and is able to live easily and believe in God at the same time. Okay, so just to make sure that I'm getting your question correct, if we had to put this into like a more specific example, right? If let's say there's a person who lived a rich, lavish lifestyle, right? They were wealthy. They lived in a mansion. They had their own yacht. Let's even up it to a private jet. Let's say this person lived comfortable and easy their entire lives. But when they're on their deathbed, as they were dying, they had a revelation of Jesus, and they realized, and so not just for the sake of just suddenly fearing that maybe hell might be real, and in a kind of like a quick way to just get into heaven. Let's say they genuinely came to faith, right? Let's say they genuinely had an encounter, and they genuinely believe that Jesus really is who he says he is, that he really is the way, the truth, and the life, and that God so loved the world, he sent Jesus to save us, to forgive us of our sins, and to make a way to restore us back to God. Let's say they really believe that. If they accepted it, they would go to heaven. I believe that they would go to heaven, that they would be justified by their faith. And now, I do not, just to throw in a disclaimer, because of that, a lot of people, they come to this conclusion that, okay, then I might as well just live my life now. I might as well just enjoy the pleasures of this world, and then right before I die, then I'll accept Jesus, right? If it's that easy. But here's the thing, right? First of all, you don't know when you're gonna die, right? You could go tonight. Life is not promised. Our days are not promised. You don't know, right? So why even take that chance, right? We don't know exactly how our life is gonna pan out. And then also, like I just said before, right? There are so many more paths that lead to hell, that lead to destruction, and those paths are easy, right? As was stated by Jesus, those paths are easy to take. Those paths are easy to get lost on, right? Those paths are easy to just to go down, but they're hard to come back from, right? They're not easy to come back from. The path to heaven, the way of Jesus Christ, is straight and narrow. It is not the easy path to take. It is not the popular path to take, and it takes a lot of discipline, a lot of faith, a lot of trust in God. It really requires us to to seek Him and to depend on Him on a daily basis, right? This is required for us to maintain our faith and to remain on this path, the straight and narrow. And so, if that's not what we're practicing, then who's to say that? Like, how can you, how could you be so naive to think that you could find your way out of that, right? That you could somehow undo the crazy circles and paths and winding roads that you've taken in life, right? Like how arrogant one must be to think that we can somehow undo of that, and somehow backtrack after decades later and come to a place where we can genuinely accept Christ into our lives. Sorry, most likely when we take those paths in life, we'll get to a place where we're very hardened, very calloused, very dry, completely fallen away from God, and very atheist or agnostic, and we'll be in that place where it would be nothing short of a miracle for someone to work their way out of that, right? And so that's not a risk that I would personally ever want to take, and that is not a risk that I would ever advise anyone to take. But if that kind of timing is what you're having issues with, I would point you to the parable of the workers in the vineyard, where Jesus shared this parable where there are workers that so the owner of the vineyard, they went out and they found laborers to come and to work in their vineyard early in the morning. And so they had been working all day to receive their day's wage. But right before the day ended, right before evening came, the owner went out and picked up some more workers, and they brought them. And so the workers that had just been working maybe a few hours compared to all day received the same wages. So every single one of them received the same wage. And so even in that parable that Jesus shared, the people that had been there all day found it unfair. When they went to the owner to receive their day's wage, they were like, hey, why did the people that just got here get paid the same as me? Or I find that completely unfair. But the owner's response to them was, it's my money, right? Like I can do whatever I please with my money. If I want to pay those that just got here the same wage, like what is that to you? Like what does that matter to you? You got what you worked for. You got what you deserve. I was true to my promise. And I wanted to show a little extra grace, a little extra favor to those that didn't work as much, right? And this parable is shared to describe the kingdom of God, and about how there are going to be those that were oppressed, not treated as fairly here on this earth, but but in the kingdom of God, God will grant them more, right? Because of the suffering and oppression that they had to endure here on this earth, right? And so even in that situation, there might be those Christians of us that are like, hey, I lived my entire life working my butt off for you, right? Even in the parable of the prodigal son, right? There's a son that asked for his inheritance early. It's like, Dad, I can't wait till you die. Give me my money now. And he went out and he squandered all of it. And then he came back, and the older brother, who'd been faithful and working hard in his father's home, he was mad that his dad welcomed him back and threw a feast for him, right? And didn't acknowledge the older brother that was there the whole time being faithful, right? And so a lot of us may have that similar attitude, that it's like, hey, God, I've done all this for you, but you're going to just go ahead and accept this guy that just accepted you on his deathbed, right? And but we're not in the place to be able to say something like that, right? Because again, we do not earn salvation. We don't deserve salvation. We do not deserve God's grace. We do not deserve His mercy. And so we are never in a place where we can judge God on how He implements His grace and mercy. And that we should, all of us, every single one of us, no matter where on that spectrum we are, we should be absolutely grateful just to be saved, right? Just to receive that day's wage. All right. And in terms of are we allowed to be like lazy, right? To live in just in our comfort, and could we still believe in God at the same time, right? Can those two go together? And for that part of the question, I would point you towards the parable of the talents. Okay, so kind of a similar parable, similar imagery, but talking about something a little different. But if you remember the parable, there was the owner that gave 10 talents to one person, 5 talents to another person, 1 talent to another person, and they sent those people out, right? And the guy with the 1 talent, he was kind of lazy. He didn't want to risk possibly like losing that talent, and he just wanted to take the safe route, and so he buried his 1 talent, and when it was time to reap the investments of that investor, he just came back with his 1 talent and said, "Here you go, master," right? Like, this is the talent you gave me. I'm giving it right back to you. But that person was wicked in the sight of the investor, in the sight of the master, right? And the master said that this person deserves to go out and to be killed, right? But it was those that doubled that investment, right? The one that had the 5 and turned it into 10, the one that had 10 turned it into 20, right? Those that were faithful with the investments, every single one of them were rewarded, right? They're rewarded for their faithfulness, and so with that, I believe that that God has given us our lives. He has given us our talents, right? Not just money, but our abilities. He has given us life so that we could be good stewards of it, so that we could bless others with it, right? So that we could spread the gospel and the love of our God through our lives and through our abilities. And so I believe that we are also called to be faithful and to not just to live this life kind of lazy, just in our own comfort zones and whatnot. But just another point that I want to hit on in terms of responding to this question, right? If you don't consider, right, suffering for Christ a joy, right? If you think of it as a drag, right? If you think of it as like, like if you have that attitude of like, why do some people get to, take the easy route, right? Live a little more comfortably, right? Why do I have to suffer, right? Why do I have to endure these things for God? If you don't consider those things a joy, then I would challenge you that you're probably not really getting it, right? You're probably not really understanding Christ in the way that you're supposed to be understanding Him. You're not really understanding Him for who He truly is, right? And I'm going to throw out one last parable to you guys, but if you look at the parable of the 2 debtors, okay, there was a person that owed 500 denarii, okay, so that's 500 days' wages. It's a lot of money. And then there was a person that just owed 50 denarii, okay, so almost what's that, like almost 2 months worth of salary versus like almost 2 years of my math is horrible here, right? But okay, so 500 days wages versus 50 days wages, right? And Jesus was sharing this parable, and he said, right, which person, if they were both forgiven of their debts, right, the person that owed 500, the person that was owed 50, if they were both forgiven of their debts, which do you think would love the person that loaned that money to them in the first place? Which person do you think would love them more, right? And Jesus says that obviously it's the one that was forgiven much will be the one that loves much, right? So the one that is forgiven of the greater debt is the one that will give much. And so what Jesus is trying to point to here is that when we truly understand the depth of our depravity, of our sin, right? Just how unworthy and undeserving we are compared to the greatness and the majesty, the perfection, the holiness of our God, right? When we truly understand how small, how poor, how spiritually poor we are compared to God, when we really understand that, and then not just end there, but we receive the grace and the mercy and the love of God, right? It's when we're at that rock bottom place, and we receive, we understand, we fully comprehend the vastness of God's love and His mercy and His grace for us. It's then that that we will be forgiven much, and in turn be able to love much, to love God much. And so if you really get that you are a sinner, but that Jesus loves you, right, that really becomes revelation in your life, then the natural response, and I'll say from firsthand experience, is that we will gladly give Him our lives, right? It won't be a burden. And so many of you have heard so many of my stories of the struggles and times in my life that I've endured to continue to live for God, to continue to do ministry, to continue to do church work. But none of it was ever like, oh man, like this isn't worth it, right? It's not worth going through these things to be a Christian. It's never crossed my mind, right? Because when I understand the debt of love that is owed to God, that is owed to Jesus for what He has done for me, what He has accomplished for me, someone that was so undeserving, someone so unworthy, then I gladly give my life as a sacrifice, and it doesn't become a burden. It never becomes a drag. And so in that way, if that's your attitude, right? If someone accepts Jesus a minute before they die, right, you're going to be right there with the angels in heaven, clapping and partying and celebrating and just so happy and so glad that there was another brother, another sister that got it, that understood it, that received that revelation, was able to enter the kingdom of heaven, and has now made the family of God bigger, right? We won't be thinking of like, man, like I lived my entire life. Like we won't be thinking like that older brother that, I wasted my whole life trying to, do all these things to please God when I could have just, signed up right at the end, right? That will not be the thoughts that cross our mind when we truly understand who Jesus is in our lives. And so I hope that answers your guys' questions. And again, if any of that was not, did not answer your questions fully, if it was not satisfying, then please do let me know. Please reach out, and I will do my best to answer your question in the way you want it. All right, guys. Thanks for being with me here in this pretty long. I think it was a pretty long session, but I hope that was helpful. I hope that was a blessing, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.